Hi, everybody. Much like you, I was caught off guard last year when we suddenly had the term AI being used everywhere. And I think we all kind of remember this moment late in the year where things like ChatGPT, Midjourney, and DALL-E were being released to the public. And we kind of had this double whammy happening where we were getting all this large language model stuff out of nowhere that felt like it was almost sentient. And then we were having AI art pop up on us, which felt like all of a sudden AI was robbing us of creativity. And shortly after that, there was kind of this sense of dread that started to seep into the general public around AI. We were hearing from the media that it's going to be taking over things. All of a sudden, it's unstoppable. It's not something that we can really control. Silicon Valley is really excited about the opportunities that this is going to come through. Then we started seeing more and more ominous stuff pop up. We're hearing about Sam Altman from OpenAI being the Oppenheimer of our age, which I think is a bit much. We're hearing from others that it's going to be surpassing human beings sometime soon. And, we're hearing that it's just going to kind of take over everything, right? My favorite, of course, is Elon Musk making a prediction that it's going to be here in the next 5 to 6 years. And as we know, Elon Musk always makes accurate predictions. But ultimately, what started to kind of scare everybody was this talk around jobs. That we were no longer talking about automating low-level, blue-collar jobs, but we were starting talking about automating art. And I feel like art started to come into this idea of, well, if art can be automated, then design can be automated. And I heard this a lot from a lot of junior designers, folks who were getting pretty scared about this in the industry. And then we started seeing some interesting stuff popping up in the UX community itself around maybe some premature UX claims about what these tools could actually do for us as designers. I was horrified, frankly, when I started seeing designers not only using ChatGPT to generate user interview scripts, but to generate users, and then generate answers to the questions of the user interview script that the fake user answered, only to then synthesize that into insights that were fake from the beginning all the way to the end. We were seeing YouTubers talking about how this is going to change your entire workflow, and that how ChatGPT is going to change the game for designers. We've all seen probably somebody at some point in time talking about how if you're not using AI in your work, you're going to be kind of left behind. So at this point in time, I decided that, well, I also fired something off to the organizers here that I wanted to do this talk. But two, I had really started digging into understanding this topic, especially for designers. I realized that we didn't really fully understand the capabilities of this technology. Engineers weren't doing a very good job of talking to us about it. And in general, it felt like we were losing some agency over our own careers. And through doing this research, I decided that I could kind of boil down the AI revolution into a single song. I'm going to go ahead and play a small part of this song. Some of you are going to be familiar with it. Some of you won't. And then halfway through, I'm going to show the lyrics of the song because I think the lyrics are really what communicate the AI revolution best to us as designers. All right, so as you can see from the lyrics, they're really compelling in terms of AI. For those of you who don't know, the song, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, is Prisen Colin Eisen and Chusel. It's a song written by Adriano Celentano and Claudia Mori in 1972. They're Italian-born musicians. One second here, you just changed something on my screen. And they wanted to kind of mimic the way that American English sounded to Italian ears. And the idea here, I think this was a little bitter, but it's very Italian of them, that they were convinced that Italians would eat up anything that sounded American, even if it was gibberish. And they weren't wrong. The song was a hit song at that point in time. Now, I think that the reason why this applies to AI is that there's a big difference between sounding as if something is in English than it actually being in English. There's a few phrases that I'll hear oftentimes in conversations around AI that I think are quite telling to this whole thing around it's as if it's being intelligent. It's as if it is doing this. It looks like it is analyzing this design. And those are kind of cues to us that maybe it's not actually doing those things, it's just appearing to do those things. And this is kind of what ultimately comes down to one of the main theses of this talk, that design AI may actually be a myth. The idea that AI is coming for our jobs as designers is a myth. But on the converse side of that, there are still some very real dangers with this technology that we as designers need to understand and be really sober about, so that way as we're designing for our users, we are not committing some of the sins that frankly we're seeing in the community right now. Now, what we're going to cover today is pretty beefy. We're going to get into the history of AI, and we're going to kind of start from the beginning of the research field itself. We're then going to dive into the innovations that recently came about and how they actually work, so that way we can understand what these large language models are actually doing and what their limitations are. To that same point, we're going to talk about limitations of these AI systems. And we're going to talk about this both from the lens of the current models that we have today and what they may provide to us, as well as talking about some of the artificial general intelligence ideas that are popping up as well. We're going to then get into some of the real dangers around this, especially around design and using this in your design process and how we should be thinking about it. And then finally, because I'm not a negative person at all, we're going to talk about hope and what designers can actually do and how we can kind of gain back some agency over this whole situation. But before we do that, I want to talk about some caveats just to make certain that I set the stage here. I am not a computer science researcher working in artificial intelligence, all right? Let's just set the stage right there. I am a product designer just like you are. I am just someone who has an inability to stop my brain from digging into topics too far. The people who work in AI are very smart people, and most of them have some good intentions. This is not me trying to slag on anybody who feels like AI is something that's genuinely going to change the course of humanity. I'm not here to rag on products or make anyone look stupid or anything like that at all. I genuinely believe that everyone who's working on this stuff, most people, have some good intentions about what it is that they're doing, and I want to take them at their word for that. I am going to assume in this talk some basic familiarity with some of the AI jargon coming around, such as AI and AGI. I wanted to include some stuff in here about this, and sadly wasn't able to fit it in due to the time constraints. And then finally, generalizations are going to be necessary for a topic this dense. I'm going to be hitting on some things that are as deep as I possibly can get to, but there's still going to be some pretty broad strokes. This topic is really, really heavy. There's a lot of interesting and fascinating history around it, around the development, around some of the internal debates in the AI community. I'm just not able to hit on all of that today for you. So hopefully this will give you a jumping off point for some of your own AI research that I hope some of you go through. So that said, let's go ahead and get into the history of AI. And like I said, we're going to mostly start with this as a fruitful research engagement. And the field of research started 70 years ago in 1956, and which kind of tells us that artificial intelligence has been baked into computer science almost since the very beginning, and there's a tell there for you. And it was led by a group named John McCarthy at Dartmouth College, and they decided that they were going to work on AI together. So they wrote a proposal to the college for a summer research project, and they explained out what some of their goals in this project were. And from the proposal, they say, The study is to proceed on the basis of conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So they're saying anything that the human brain can do, we do think that machines can do this for us. They had a lot of confidence in this idea. As a matter of fact, the more shocking part of this for me was they go on to say in the proposal, we think that a significant advance can be made in one or more of these problems if a carefully selected group of scientists work on it together for a summer. So in 1957, we are just to make certain that we're setting the context for this argument that they're making. This was on a computer in 1957 that they thought that they were going to be able to develop the human mind and replicate it on. And just for context, modern laptops are about a quadrillion times more powerful than the full room computer that they're using with tape drives and stuff there. But having said that, they were pretty confident that they were going to be able to do this in a summer and that the technology was going to be absolutely possible at that time frame. And the big thing for us here is, does this sound familiar to anybody? Especially when you hear a lot of people who talk in what I'm calling the AGI soon crowd. They say things like, oh, all we got to do is figure out common sense, and artificial intelligence is right there. All we got to do is give it morals, and it'll be right there. We just need to develop a self-learning mechanism for it, and it's solved. They try to simplify things down, and this is very much impregnated into the DNA of this field. Now, once you get your money, you now have to figure out how you're going to spend that money. And this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, where they really needed to make some choices about what methods, how were they going to approach this problem of developing AI. And there was a lot of debate around the problem. There was a lot of debate at the time around the nature of consciousness and intelligence. But ultimately, two major methods became dominant at this time. And we're going to go through both of those today. The first one is what's called symbolic AI. And this is based on symbolic representations of objects such as logic, ideas, nouns, all these kinds of things. And this has really actually kind of informed a lot of our current technology around searching the web, semantic markup, things like this. And symbolic AI was actually pretty popular for a long time. This was the one that people thought was going to be the gold star, the way to develop AI, so they decided they were going to go ahead and use this, and it really dominated the landscape in AI through until the 90s. Now, one of the other nice things about symbolic AI was that it was readable by human beings. I could look at a diagram of a symbolic AI and understand it. As you can see on the right, I can see the associations and the connections. And one of the things I thought was too fascinating not to include in this is that the researchers, in order to develop these symbolic systems, would sit down with users and have them talk out loud while they were solving through a problem. And then they would try to transcribe that process into the AI system itself. So in many ways, AI has kind of developed contextual inquiry way before we thought it was contextual inquiry. Now, the next version of AI that we're going to talk about, or methodology or concept, is called subsymbolic AI. This is the least sexy of the two of them. But here in subsymbolic AI, they decided to bypass readability entirely and then focus more instead on perception and recognition. So make the system faster, and maybe if it's fast enough, it'll actually develop an AI at that point in time. So where symbolic AI use symbols to accomplish a task, subsymbolic AI just uses pure math and data. Now, subsymbolic AI did have some support at the time when we were first developing these things, but it really didn't become serious until the 90s. There were some people who were working on it, a little bit here and there. And as a matter of fact, there's a historical concept from subsymbolic AI, that's so hard to say, that's been really critical to modern AI systems that we're using now in large language models. And it's this thing called the perceptron, which is maybe the best 1960s sci-fi name for something ever. But ultimately, the perceptron was developed by a man named Frank Rosenblatt He was a psychologist, and it was inspired by neurons. And essentially, it was all about how the synapses between neurons and how they reinforce when we see memories being run through them and things like that. And this is essentially the precursor to neural networks. This was actually the idea that was revived for neural networks. This was really powerful, but it was sadly shelved until symbolic AI became unpopular. So basically, until symbolic AI showed that it really wasn't going to meet its promises, sub-symbolic AI wasn't something that people were particularly interested in. And with this, there's been this kind of cycle that's happened in the AI community, to the point where this is a named thing that they talk about, where essentially there is this period where a new advancement comes out, maybe a new paper is released, a new trick is announced to the world where it seems like AI is coming and it's right down the pipe. Funding will explode. The imaginations of the public are then lit up, and they have what's called an AI summer, where everybody wants to give them money to develop their AIs. The downside is that eventually those promises are never made or never fulfilled. The public starts losing interest, and eventually funding starts to dry up. And this turns into what we call the AI winter, all right? Now, the funny thing is, to me, is that this has been going on now for 70 years, where every once in a while, there will be some new cool advance. It'll be computer vision one time. It'll be, machine learning, because we don't want to call it artificial intelligence another time. And we've seen this pop up and down, all right? And why does this matter to us when we're trying to assess the value of the AI that we're being, talked about today? First, this whole AGI soon thing that, AI is right around the corner has been happening for 70 years. This is not something that is a new phenomenon. It is not something that's only been happening in the past 15, 20 years. Almost none of the current concepts in AI, and I'm sure this will piss off somebody who works in the field, are new. Almost everything is based off of a lot of the old ideas that were developed at the start of this entire endeavor. They're still relying on 70-year-old assumptions around the idea that the brain must just be a meat computer, and that just means that it's easy to transfer over to a silicon computer. And every AI summer, we are told, this time is different. AGI is actually coming this time. It's actually right around the corner. AI in your home is going to be right there. But this time can't possibly be different, right? The thing is, we're going to talk about how it's different. And we're first going to get into how these things work and what some of the major advances were. There's a lot to dig into on this, but instead of us going into the different types of artificial intelligence models that are being used right now, we're going to exclusively focus on deep learning networks, because these are the ones that apply the most to what's kind of currently going on today. So after the last AI winter, there was this big revival around the perceptron. We were seeing big advances in compute power, in storage, in internet speeds, and things like this, and suddenly this idea was starting to seem pretty viable. So the perceptron, or the neuron, if we want to kind of call it this at this point in time, are just basically nodes within a neural network that make a calculation, and then they output that sequentially down the chain to other nodes in the system. And a collection of nodes in a system, a vertical collection, is what's called a processing layer in a deep learning network. The more layers that you have, the better it is at performing given tasks. But the downside is that it's significantly slower. So there's always been this kind of trade-off of how do we build in more layers into the system without slowing it down and making it not valuable. So to kind of break down the diagram around deep learning networks and how they work, there is what's first called the input layer, which is where we see the inputs or the system being exposed to data. There is the output layer, where the prediction that the system has made is now being exposed to the user. But the more interesting part of all of this are the hidden layers, where all the individual steps and the increase in fidelity about the predictions it's making kind of goes on. So basically, the farther down you go down this chain, the more accurate these predictions get. So in our example here of, draw someone with a sick mustache, the first thing it might do is determine the head shape that it needs to do. Then it may determine where the mouth is going, and then finally draw the mustache itself. Now, as I mentioned, the bigger these networks get, the slower they get. And this has been a bit of a battle for a big period of time. But in 2017, there was a big shift that happened that really enabled these things to be fast and fairly responsive. And it's this concept of transformer architecture. And this was written in a paper in 2017 called "Attention is All You Need." And this is really what kind of changed the game for everybody. These attention mechanisms, which is what the paper talks about, are these new hidden layers in deep learning networks. And as I mentioned before, the systems had to work sequentially before, right? It had to go from the left to the right, all those kind of things. The really powerful thing about transformers is that they pre-weighted portions of the input by relevance. And that ended up allowing it to help speed up and kind of work asynchronously, take in text all at once rather than in little bits, all that kind of fun jargon that I'm not going to get into too much here. Now, a matter of fact, ChatGPT as a term stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. The name ChatGPT itself sounds kind of scary until you see it like that, and suddenly it sounds less interesting, which is partially why I wanted to talk about it here. But as mentioned, this really vastly sped up the processing power of deep learning networks. As a matter of fact, this has really become, transformer networks have become like the dominant model of today. This is everything from ChatGPT, anything that's large language model, all the way to AI art is using these transformer networks as the basis for what they're doing. Now, one of the main things about these that I really want everyone to take away from these transformers is that they provide a lot of flexibility in processing. But one of the things that isn't well understood, especially amongst the design community, is that processing is not the same thing as understanding. So when we talk about natural language processing, processing is about determining the predictions of words and, formatting and these kind of things, whereas understanding is fundamentally different. And this was something that I was trying to figure out how to explain in this topic, or in this talk. And it's when I came across this lovely paper written by Emily Bender and Alexander Kohler about climbing towards natural language understanding. And this paper, I thoroughly recommend reading this if you're interested in the topic at all, because it really gets into the nature of extracting these languages and some of the challenges that are baked into the system that honestly we're not entirely certain these systems are going to be capable of getting over. Now, with that said, there's actually this amazing analogy in this paper that I'm going to walk you through today. Initially, I was going to develop all of the art for these next few slides using AI art. After spending countless hours banging my head against the table and trying to learn how to prompt these things correctly, I couldn't get anything that was even remotely usable. So today you're going to mostly be getting clip art from me, and I apologize for that. That's the right response. So our tale starts with two English speakers named A and B, and each of them are stranded on their own deserted island. They each use a telegraph connected via a cable to communicate with each other via Morse code. You're going to have to go with this analogy. It's weird that they have telegraphs, but we're just going to go with it. Now, one day, there's an octopus named O who arrives on the ocean floor between the two islands. O has never been out of water, so O doesn't know the life above the waves. He only has a rough idea of what's kind of happening up there. But O can sense the Morse code in the cable. Now, O is hyper-intelligent, and this is a unique case for O that maybe we'll talk about in a little bit. And O doesn't understand English or Morse code, but they are very good at detecting patterns. So O figures out that some patterns, or words, show up in certain contexts and not others, and sometimes they're interchangeable. It's starting to pick up and predict if A says something to B, what B's response may be to A. So O has never observed these words in context, only in Morse code. So the only thing that they've had available to them is the Morse code coming in and coming out and developing a pattern library for themselves there. Now, one day, O decides to level up. O is feeling lonely and decides they want to start communicating in some capacity. But for some reason, O decides that they don't want to be discovered, and I think it's just due to this need to be analogy that works. And O cuts the cable and decides to start intercepting the messages. But O, being shy, is only responding to A as if they are B. So again, they're not responding as O. O is just saying, oh, I'm going to pretend that I am B and talk from there. Just to reinforce it, O doesn't know the meaning or the context of the impulses that they're getting. They just understand the statistical probability of what is going to be said in response to one set of codes. So for instance, O is mostly being exposed to dialogue that's of their routines of the day, of what they're just doing in daily boring life around the island. And for the most part, O does a pretty good job of understanding how that's working. O is picking it up and feeling really good about it. But then one day, something bad happens. A bear enters the scene on the island. And A feverishly types out on the telegraph, as one does when being attacked by a bear, "Help, I'm being attacked by a bear, and all I have is 2 sticks. How do I fashion a weapon to defeat this bear?" And O responds with, "Take 1 stick and punch the bear, and then run faster to the store. Wait there until the bear is gone, and then give her all the sticks. Then go back inside and get your gun." Now, this was an actual output from ChatGPT that Emily had inserted in the story, which I absolutely love. I felt it would only be intellectually honest, though, if I actually included a response from ChatGPT 4, just to show like how much better it is than ChatGPT 2. And admittedly, it does a better job. My favorite is, "Talk to the bear in a calm but firm voice, avoiding eye contact. Sometimes this can make the bear aware that you're human and not a prey animal." So logically very consistent, at least more practical advice, and still utterly useless. The main thing here that I think is really important about all of this is that, again, ChatGPT and all of these large language models are working off of statistical probabilities of what next words and phrases are going to be probable based on what prompt you gave it. And this is where we're starting to see some trouble with the general public not understanding that concept, where we see, for instance, news organizations starting to use ChatGPT to write articles, only to have to retract all of those articles because they're littered with falsehoods and incorrect information. My personal favorite is the poor lawyer in the United States who decided to write a legal briefing using ChatGPT, and it cited case law that did not exist, and it even had links to PDFs that did not exist. And this poor man had to sit 2 hours in court being admonished by the judge for doing something so stupid. And again, we talk, some people in the AI community will say, like, oh, these are just old examples, the systems are getting better. Well, just earlier this month, Amazon Alexa was still claiming that the 2020 election in the United States was stolen. This is just earlier this month, and it's kind of crazy that even still we are seeing these kinds of fake pieces of information being injected out of nowhere. Now, to kind of highlight this, I have an old example of a personal example with these issues with training data and the system not fully understanding things. For some reason, a lot of voice assistants don't understand how I talk at all. This is something that I've really struggled with. I love the idea of voice dictation. I have some typing issues, so it's something I've been always really excited about. I usually spend more time trying to edit that stuff than I do actually just speaking it. But here's an example of me at home one night in bed, apologies, trying to find out what time it was. Let's see if it'll play for me.
Okay, Google, what time is it?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Okay, Google, what time is it?
It's 10:59 p.m.
Okay, Google, what time is it?
Sorry, I don't understand.
Okay, Google, what time is it?
It's 10:59 p.m.
Okay, Google, what time is it?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Okay, Google, what time is it?
11 p.m.
I will tell you right now, when I was recording that, it seemed like I was in a good mood. I was actually really angry at the moment. I just wanted to know what time was. I couldn't believe that I was using these ridiculous voices and it was understanding me perfectly. But me trying to speak in an articulate way was just kind of falling apart. So what does this mean to us? What's the value that we get from understanding the history and how these things kind of work? I think the big thing that I want folks to understand here, especially as designers, is that these are large language models. These are not large knowledge models, all right? Language may contain information in it. It may contain knowledge in it, but language is not the same thing as knowledge, all right? While these are being trained on pieces of text from the internet, that does not mean that it's storing information in a way where it understands that it's storing information. So they're not a source of truth. I think this is one of the big challenges that we have right now, is that people are treating them as if they are a search engine that can simply be asked questions and it's going to give them a truthful response. They generate misinformation naturally. I was going to have a whole section about hallucinations and I decided not to, but this is a thing that they really, really do, and they don't even know if it's a problem that will go away. They are predicting words and phrases most probable to the prompt that you are giving it. And the thing to keep in mind about probabilities is that they tend to skew towards generic outputs. This means that all the rough edges are going to be probably sanded off of a question that you ask around, say, design trends or other things. It's going to give you the most generic response based on the information that it has available to it. So another thing I really want us to kind of keep in mind here is that these training data sets are really critical to the success of these systems. And what's included in those data sets is just as important as what's excluded from those data sets. And with that said, I do want to kind of go through what these things are good at. I don't want to pretend that they're just dumb machines that don't understand what they're doing or there's no value in them. There's a lot of value that they can bring to us. They're just not these little magical machines that we're being told that they are. So things that these deep learning networks are really, really good at are things like computer code. They're remarkably good at computer code, although there's a reason for that is because computer code is language that is fairly, specific in terms of what it's doing. They're great at summarizing. They're fantastic at labeling images and the reverse of that, generating images based off of those labels. They're great at formatting text. They're fantastic for journalistic style guides or brand voicing and things like that. And they're fantastic about talking about math, which we'll get to in a little bit. And then finally, the obvious one, which is auto-completion and generation. Now, the things that they're not good at are the knowledge stuff. And I think it's just a good contrast to kind of highlight what I'm talking about here. And by knowledge stuff, I mean things like storytelling and continuity. While it can write a story, that's not the same thing as telling a story. They're awful at nuance. They don't understand that, words may have different meanings. They're terrible at interpretation and extrapolation. There's simply no way for them to be able to take something that is vague, interpret it, and then extrapolate it out to another scenario, much in a way that toddlers that are human do. Composition, I think, is actually, frankly, one of the bigger ones that we should be talking about, both as designers and as artists. While AI can certainly draw, it can't compose a scene that tells a story. They're not good at performing math. This is something that I think people actually don't understand as well as they think they do. It's good at math problems that it has text responses to on the internet, such as discussions about what is 2 + 2 = 4. But you ask it to do basic multiplication or other things like that, and it falls apart completely because it simply doesn't have the capability of doing that. They're not good at workflows. Right? They don't understand how a human brain is going to go through a series of tasks and how asynchronous that may or may not need to be. And then finally, they're not very good at synthesis. And I mean that both in the sense of user research and just in general of taking a series of inputs and being able to derive an insight or a hypothesis from that. So with that said, we're going to go through some of the limitations of these systems. I'm going to hit on this fairly briefly. But both AI now and AGI soon have some pretty serious limitations in terms of where they're going. I think one of the big things that scares us as designers and just the general public is this feeling of a continuum, that this came out of nowhere and it must keep going in one direction and keep getting better over time. If it's this good in a year, it must be even better a year and a half from now. But in reality, there's a lot of limitations around these things, preventing them from potentially getting better than where they're at today. Just real quick before we get into those, there is this fantastic paper called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots. Can large language models be too big? These are written by 4 amazing people in the field, and this goes through in even more detail the things that I'm about to right now around why these systems shouldn't be as big as they are, and some of the genuine consequences of that happening, and it is not Skynet. Now, let's go ahead and get into the environmental aspect of these things first, because I think that we talk about this every once in a while, but we don't really fully understand about what the environmental impact of these systems is going to be. Daily ChatGPT requests use the same power as 33,000 households in the United States. That's a ridiculous number for one system that is mostly being used to write some dumb emails, right? Now, the thing to keep in mind with this is that may not seem like a lot, but this is one system. And we're talking about this changing our world. So to scale these things up means that it takes a considerable amount of information to go through. Semiconductor manufacturing is also deeply hazardous to the environment itself, extracting precious metals, all those kinds of things. Scaling is one of the most important parts to these systems, and scaling is something that is deeply important to them. As a matter of fact, they think that artificial general intelligence, the assumption is that they'll never get there unless they scale up these large language models. I don't think that's correct, but we'll talk about that. The downside, though, is that in order to scale these up, they have to take in a bunch of information, and they need to then scrub that information of awful content. And right now, for instance, OpenAI has been employing people in Kenya for $2 an hour to scrub content of child porn, human mutilation, bestiality, and other kind of vile content. These people are suffering because of this. I can't imagine being paid $2 an hour to look at this all day long, but this is a real genuine cost of AI, just so that way we can feel good about it writing some interview scripts for us. There's some real technology limitations to this that I'm not going to dig into too much, but for instance, Moore's Law is something that we are starting to see hit the upper limits of. AMD's CEO has said that Moore's Law is something that they feel is actually ending soon. For those of you who don't know, Moore's Law just has to do with computer cycle times and things like that, the amount of transistors that go onto a semiconductor. And we're starting to hit the upper limit of that, which means that silicon architecture may not be something that's particularly viable for artificial intelligence. Now, some people will then go on to say, well, what about quantum computing? Quantum computing is turning out to be maybe not as impressive or near as some people in that research field have been purporting it to be as well. Ability is a big thing here too. Is it even possible for us to develop these things in the first place? While it's certainly cool that we developed large language models, is it really possible for us to develop things that are even more useful to us? And these are all kind of based on one big assumption that the brain is a computer that can be replicated in a binary encoded piece of software. Now, people just assume that this must be true, right? One thing does math, humans do math, it should work out right. The thing is that humans have been thinking this way for a really long period of time. With the invention of hydraulics, all of a sudden the concept of the humors came about. And this is one of the dominant theories of human intelligence for almost 1,600 years. We saw people when the inventions of springs and cogs came about. Thomas Hobbes thought that the brain might have tiny little machines in it working, and that's how that process went about. Chemistry, electricity, even in the 1800s, when communication was coming around, Hermann von Holtz thought that the brain was like a telegraph. So it just kind of comes down to the fact that human metaphors and conceptual models are almost always based off of what the current technology is. This is just a part of what we do. We develop computers, and right away we're like, oh, we're just going to put artificial intelligence in these things right away. And on top of that, we don't even know how the brain works. If you ask cognitive scientists when they're going to figure out how the human brain works, I've even read some of them say it's going to be 50 to 100 years before we know how the human brain works. And yet computer scientists are pretty convinced that they understand it. Just last year, there was the discovery that the human brain may be using quantum effects in its cognitive processes. Here's the thing that we didn't know about in 1956, and yet we're still basing a lot of our artificial intelligence concepts off of the perceptron. Now, there's this other incredible paper that I want to refer folks to called Why AI is Harder Than We Think. This is written by an amazing researcher named Melanie Mitchell. And she breaks down 4 main fallacies of artificial intelligence that make us think that it's coming soon, but in reality may be even farther off than we think that it is. I recommend reading it. I have a link to this, by the way, at the end of the talk for you, but sadly I'm not going to be able to get into those today. So AGI isn't anytime soon, and AI now is limited in its use cases, but that doesn't mean that these things aren't dangerous to us today. I think one of the problems, though, is that the AGI soon crowd out there, the people who want to tell us that artificial intelligence is right around the corner, are doing so that way we focus exclusively on a concept that may never happen, so that way we don't regulate them today. I really do think this is the big play that they're kind of going for. It's a bit of a smokescreen, so to speak. And I think the main thing I really want us to impart with this is that threats such as artificial general intelligence taking away all of our jobs, don't have to be real to be dangerous or to keep people oppressed. If I tell you that I have a gun in my pocket, and then if you don't give me all of your money, you're not going to sit there and wonder if the gun is in my pocket or not. You're going to believe me, and you're going to give me your money. At least I would think that you would. And by the way, there's a whole load of other ethical threats that we need to deal with in terms of AI as it is today, around threats to democracy, the black boxing of civil rights, and racial bias, information pollution, data labeling, and slave labor, and just power consolidation in the hands of a few companies. Philosophy Tube has a fantastic video that just recently came out just on the ethics of AI. I thoroughly recommend that you watch this one. It's absolutely riveting, and it was why I was able to cut this section from my talk without having to worry about it too much. So let's go ahead and talk about AI in UX really quick and in our processes. We're going to hit on this pretty quick. Something for us to keep in mind is that, again, the training data is what's really important to these models. So when we're talking about using AI in our processes as designers, the training data is what's going to matter on if it's valuable to us or not. The trick here is that OpenAI, for instance, is trained on the entire internet. This means that the things that we ask it about AI or about UX are going to be polluted by ancillary topics such as marketing, graphic and print design, or anything that just references design very generically. It's going to pollute everything that we're asking of these systems. And even the UX-specific training data isn't particularly valuable to us. It's going to be full of listicles, like the 10 things you should never do in UX, incorrect or outdated articles about bad advice in UX, or high-level examples of artifacts. And what I mean by that is when it's being trained on affinity diagrams that look like this, that are overly simplistic, or in articles, I personally won't expect it to do very much for us when I'm actually telling it to do an affinity map for me. So there's 3 main considerations I want us to go through when we're looking at these next set of tools, and we're going to kind of briefly hit on some of the main players right now in the UX space. What's in their training data? Will they use my work for training data? And what does it promise to do for me? Now, Otter AI is one of the first ones. Honestly, I think Otter AI is actually pretty good in terms of what value it brings to us. This is a transcription and summarization service. It's not clear on what it's trained on. They don't include it on their website at all. They do say that they will use your information for training data, but they will mask identities, which I at least appreciate that they're calling it out. And they do say that they are connected to some third-party LLMs. So pretty straightforward, and the value proposition here is very much in line with large language models. Coco is using OpenAI, so again, they're not using their own training data for it. They do explicitly state that they will not be using your data for training, which I do appreciate them calling that out. But they do get into things like journey maps, personas, and interview scripts, which I have a little bit of concerns about in terms of us using it, especially for journey maps. Craftful is where we start getting into the more shady area of topics on this, if I may. It's OpenAI powered, but they don't say much about AI specifics in their privacy policy at all, so we have no idea if when you upload client data to this system, if they're going to use it in their training data set. And they talk about giving you feedback analysis. You can talk to your data. I don't know what that means. They don't even provide examples of it. And you can export to Jira, which I'm sure every designer here loves as a concept. As a matter of fact, one of my coworkers used Craftful recently to give it a test, and it had about half of what its affinity mapping was wrong. It had tried to put together some insights, and they were all off. She couldn't even use the information whatsoever. Synthetic users are challenging, to say the very least. They are purporting to develop actual synthetic users that you can ask interview questions of and have them give you feedback on your designs. There's really questionable stuff kind of going on here. These folks are really defensive online. Something that I find particularly gross, for lack of a better term, is that when you, on their website, if you ask, how do they ensure that their results are unbiased, they say, we don't, because people are biased and we don't want to, our synthetic users are real, right? And what they don't understand is that people are mostly talking about the bias built into large language models, not into the users themselves. Builder.io was one of my biggest heartbreaks of this entire research project. I do think that the ability to transcribe designs into code and into workable prototypes is the main thing that designers are going to be using AI for in terms of speed to market and efficiency and things like that. So I went ahead and put some designs in from an old project of mine that I was really excited about to see how well it did. And at first glance, it didn't look too bad until I zoomed in, and this was the code that it gave me. This should be the easiest use case for these systems, and as you can tell, it's pretty far off. This is not usable code. I wouldn't hand this over to an engineer to implement. I just kind of expected more from it at this point in time. And then my personal favorite is now we're having designers using ChatGPT-4 to provide feedback on designs. They'll say, hey, as a UX expert, go ahead and tell me about my design and what I can do. And it seems cool. It gives you some things. And it's not wrong, technically speaking. The downside, though, is that it's all generic and it's fairly obvious. It says things like, I love that you put a title here, and isn't it cool that you have a drop-down menu, and consider using tabs when they're already using tabs. And I went ahead and used an old actual production design of mine to include in it to see if I would get something different, and I didn't. I mostly got the exact same kind of feedback. I love that you have buttons that tell people to submit things, and it's great that you have a close button here. It's like, I know these things, right? I'm the one who designed it. I kind of had this kind of figured out. None of these design tools understand design principles. They just understand mimicry. They don't provide any feedback that's actionable. And they don't do better than a junior designer with a design system or a template, right? This isn't that impressive of a thing. It's great that it can tell me what I already know, but I need something more from that. So we need to be really careful about using AI in UX. It doesn't know the truth from fiction. It can't and should not replace people or your users. We should be really careful in terms of how we use it in synthesis. I think a lot of people are using it for synthesis right now, but it doesn't really understand how we do synthesis, so it's really dangerous. When we're doing client work, we should be telling clients that we are using AI for these things, and are they okay with it? They may have policies in place that prevent you from uploading your data into a system that's going to be trained upon it. And I have 1 minute left, so we're going to move through a little bit faster. And be skeptical until you get case studies or training data, right? None of these places have actual case studies showing how these things should work for you, and then we should be asking more from them than just a pretty example of shoe e-commerce that most of them tend to use. Now, with all this said, there is a lot of hope that I don't want us to feel like, these systems are just going to kind of run roughshod over designers and that we don't have a lot of control over these things. But first off, one thing I want us to kind of consider is that an AI winter may actually already be coming and nearly upon us already. OpenAI's CEO is already saying that the age of large models is over. It's not a particularly efficient system, and it's not particularly full of revenue. And by not full of revenue, I mean everyone's losing money on it right now. Microsoft, their Copilot for engineers was supposed to be their big thing. For every $10 that an engineer spends on Copilot, they lose $20 on average, and they lose as high as $80 on engineers. Now, while it may do good things for engineers, most likely that simply means that if it's not profitable, no one's going to be running these things pretty soon, all right? So we need to be really careful about that. There's other things that we're starting to see people out in the wild saying, this is great, but when is it going to do something other than give me a recipe or fix my punctuation, right? It's cool that it's doing these things, but ultimately the rubber needs to hit the road. Things like Watson, for instance, their whole health program wasn't working out particularly well for them. Other great things that are happening, especially in the EU, regulation is coming around AI. There are some great things that are happening with it, but sadly there are also some pieces around like being citable and readable and being able to explain itself that I wish were in the legislation around this. This is where the EU is beating the pants off of the states right now. We don't have any regulation because we don't have a functioning government. One great thing too, IBM is taking ethics very seriously. They are leading the charge in terms of ethics around artificial intelligence. They have a whole thing called the Granite model that is all about transparency and ethics built in. They are going to be exposing their training data. They have stated this explicitly. They are the first company to state that they will be exposing the training data to their customers so they can look at it. And even Microsoft and Google have started to develop some practices around these things. I do bring these up, by the way, because these are things I recommend you take a look at. The stuff that IBM has on this topic is really fantastic. But one of the things I want us to keep in mind here is that AI doesn't lessen the human experience. When Deep Blue beat Gary in chess, everyone felt like everything was over. But chess is more popular today than it has ever been in its history. When the former Go champion was beaten by AlphaGo, he quit Go. He was going to retire at that point in time. And then shortly after found a way to beat the system, all right? So it doesn't take the joy out of what we do. And one of the things I really want us to kind of end on here is that while designers maybe shouldn't be indulging in AI, we should be really careful about how we're using it in our tools. We shouldn't be fearing AI. But most importantly, we have the ability to help shape these systems. And I don't think we really understand how much agency and power we have over these. There's this new concept popping up right now, a whole new discipline called human-centered AI, or HCAI, because we have to acronym everything. And the great thing about this is that it's been embraced by IBM and some other companies. The focus on HCAI is around putting human needs at the center of the interactions for artificial intelligence, that it's not us serving them, it's the other way around. It's about providing users with autonomy, even if we are automating some things from them. And we are providing transparency to our users about how these LLMs are working for them, so that way they can make better choices about if information is correct or not. They don't want to treat AI as a super tool. They don't want to emulate humans. It's about reliability over novelty, so making certain that it's something that's consistent over rather than it developing things that are cool. And then one of the biggest things, it's a shift away from anthropomorphic language, such as talking about computers acting as if they're brains, that they can read, they can write, they can think, and all these kinds of things. So I know that it's been kind of a hard year in the UX discipline. There's been a lot of layoffs. We've seen a lot of turnover in places. We've had a lot of criticism from other designers about the death of UX and how it's not something that maybe, we're seeing entire departments kind of get decimated. And I know that especially that as designers, UX design is the most personal of the three disciplines, right? Out of the three, for instance, we don't go to our engineers and say, show me your code so that way I can criticize it for the next hour, right? We don't say to our PMs, like, let me go read your stories so that way I can rewrite all of them and tell you what you did wrong. And yet, everyone in our field has a strong opinion about what we do, right? And we also kind of tend to be a little afraid when we hear things from people on LinkedIn about there's going to be two types of UX designers, those who use AI and those who will be left behind. Like, there's a lot of bravado in this. But ultimately, I think that, this sounds scary, but this doesn't mean that we have to feel pressure about using tools that may actually pollute the results of our research and things like that. We have to remember that we design interfaces, we don't design rectangles, all right? We don't design web pages, we don't design web apps. We design the interface between the technology and the user, regardless of what that is. And no matter what AI may do in the future or may not do for us, no matter what, I want us as designers to remember that empathy isn't artificial. Thank you.